Today, we're on St. Thomas and headed up to the rooftop of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're heading up Crown Mountain, the highest point in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that like and red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to them for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. The Virgin Islands are an archipelago found in the eastern Caribbean Sea. They are the easternmost islands of the Greater Antilles. They're the result of volcanism, both direct and indirect, brought about by the interaction of the Caribbean and North American plates. The location and the geological features of these islands has greatly influenced their history. The northern islands in particular were brought about by a combination of underwater mountain and ridge building, and then combined with that volcanic activity uplifting them to the surface. The oldest rocks that have been found are over on St. John, dating back 100 million years ago to the Cretaceous period. St. Croix is an exception to this. It's not a volcano, though in a geological irony, most of its rock is volcanic in origin, a sedimentary base built from the remains of eroding volcanic rocks and ash. It's a size of about 82 square miles, the largest of the 3 U.S. Virgin Islands, and its formation would later determine its colonial history. It being relatively flatter than the other islands meant it was more conducive for agriculture, particularly sugarcane. The Virgin Islands are actually comprised of 3 groups, including the U.S., the British, and the Spanish Virgin Islands. Together, they combine a total of a bit less than 100 islands, islets, rocks, and keys, and are in many ways what most people would envision as a tropical paradise. Culturally, though, the U.S. and British Virgin Islands are affiliated with the Lesser Antilles, whereas the Spanish Virgin Islands are tied in with the history of Puerto Rico. Geologically, they are separated from the Lesser Antilles by another distinct feature, the Anegada Passage. This is also the strait that connects the Atlantic and the Caribbean. To the north is the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest trench in the Atlantic, with a length of 497 miles and a depth of 27,480 feet. Both of these structures are theorized to have been brought about by faulting as the 2 plates interacted with each other. The climate here could be considered rather mild by tropical standards. Temperatures only vary from the 70s to 90s year-round. They're tempered, though, by the trade winds that blow in. Despite that, these islands do have some drawbacks. One is they're on the path of hurricanes, and those storms have racked these islands numerous times throughout the centuries. Also, that location on the fault line means these islands are also subject to earthquakes. Due to their long history of human habitation, and even more so after colonial settlement, there isn't any virgin old-growth forest to be found here. Any remnant that remained after early native settlement was stripped away by colonists looking to maximize tillable land. And this fact sheds light on the history of these islands. While today these islands are a tourist delight, they have a dark side to them, one of genocide, slavery, piracy, and colonial oppression. Humans have been living on the Virgin Islands for thousands of years. It's been theorized that 4 different waves of people, all originating from South America, settled on these islands before the arrival of Europeans. archaeological evidence, both here on St. Thomas and on Tortola in the British Virgin Islands, suggests that the oldest of these groups arrived over 4,000 years ago. By the late 15th century, it was the Taino and Kalinago people who lived on these islands. The Spanish would call them the Arawaks and Caribs to distinguish between the two groups. The Arawak were considered friendly, and the Caribs hostile. The Caribbean Sea gets its name from the latter. The islands were well populated, with numerous small communities, most relying on fishing and cultivation of fruit and vegetables. An artifact of this time can be found in the petroglyphs from the Taino peoples along the Reef Bay Trail in the national park. The first Europeans to arrive were Christopher Columbus and his crew during his second voyage to the New World. They had been blown off course, and while he had spotted the northern islands, he did not land there. He did land at St. Croix briefly, but almost immediately fell into conflict with the Kalinago people. Columbus may only have been passing through, but he did do a few things that would leave a mark. It was Columbus that gave these islands their name, the Virgin Islands. They reminded him of a story of St. Ursula and her 11,000 virgin martyrs. The Spanish would move on and settle on nearby Puerto Rico and then beyond, but their arrival would upend the native people's world. Over the next several decades, both the Taino and Kalinago would be devastated by war, enslavement, and disease. Over the next 100 years, these islands would effectively be deserted, but they wouldn't stay vacant for very long. The wild success of the Spanish conquistadors in plundering and pillaging the New World of all its riches had attracted the envy of the other European powers. And for the next inhabitants of these islands, they couldn't be in a more perfect spot. In between the demise of the Native American tribes and the establishment of European colonies, these islands were home to a more disreputable crowd, pirates. The Virgin Islands offered many advantages for their next guests: an ideal location near trade lanes, but still relatively remote, a sheltered, deep harbor, and many places to hide when the law came calling. You could see the allure of this place just by looking from here on the east end of St. Thomas to over there to St. John and beyond. All these islands and keys and little places which you could just tuck away, repair your ship, rest and refit, and get ready for your next raid. The vast quantities of gold and silver that Spain had seized in the New World had painted a target on it, and in the minds of the 16th and 17th century pirates and privateers, these galleons laden with treasure were ripe for the plundering. Sir Francis Drake, the famous English navigator, planned one of his last raids from Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands. He would follow a route that has gone down in history as Drake's Passage. Local legend has it that Drake took in his fleet here on St. Thomas at a place called Drake's Seat. It is arguable if the admiral ever observed his fleet from here, but you have to admit, it's a pretty amazing view of Magen's Bay, one of the best beaches in the West Indies. Piracy would be a key part of these islands' history for well over a century, and these islands were visited by more than a few of that rogues gallery's more notorious members, including Captain Kidd, Black Sam Bellamy, Stede Bonnet, among others. The pirates weren't run out of town, so to speak, when the Danes came to colonize these islands. Quite the opposite, in fact. Early Danish governors basically welcomed the pirates with open arms. Pirate gold was a boon to local merchants, and the governors made sure to get their cut as well. All told, this would make Charlotte Amalie one of the busiest ports in the Caribbean, but it gained a reputation, according to one English governor, as a receptacle of thieves and sea robbers. One of the most notorious of these governors was a man named Adolf Esmond. Now, Esmond was suspected of being a pirate before leading a coup to oust his brother, Nikolai, who, probably not surprising, was also suspected of being a pirate from Nikolai's governorship. Adolf Esmond was successful, and as governor, he would have no issues with pirates, as long as he got his share of any ill-gotten gains. His most infamous exploit was when he sheltered the pirate Jean Hamelin, who was being pursued by both the English and the French. Hamelin's ship had been spotted in the Charlotte Amalie harbor and was burned by the English. English soldiers searched the island, but to no avail, only to find out later that Esmond had hid the pirates in Fort Christian itself. Esmond would then help Hamelin procure a new ship to continue his piratical misdeeds. Future governors would take a harsher view towards pirates as more legitimate revenue streams started to fuel the colony's economy. But the spirit, and a bit of piracy itself, would remain. In 1822, our fifth president, James Monroe, would send a squadron of Navy ships down here to deal with pirates. And in 1860s, during the U.S. Civil War, this would be a preferred port for smugglers who were trying to run the Union blockade of Confederate ports. You can also check out two buildings named Blackbeard's and Bluebeard's castles. They aren't really castles, but guard towers that overlook the harbor. And the names are romantic only. Those two individuals would never have laid eyes on these two buildings. Today, you will find plenty of mention of pirates and buccaneers on these islands. On nearby Norman Island, it's long been thought of as the location of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And over on St. John, archaeologists recently uncovered what they believe is two pirate hideouts, shedding some invaluable light on the individuals that actually lived by that dangerous trade. And here on St. Thomas, well, you can go visit the Pirate Treasure Museum to find out more information about these scallywags and sea robbers. While the Spanish had laid claim to these islands, they had little interest in them. The first European power to really make an effort to colonize them were the Dutch. For the Netherlanders, the Virgin Islands were an ideal location, halfway between their primary colony in South America, Suriname, and their primary colony in North America, New Amsterdam, now known as New York City. Joost van Dyke would establish a settlement on Tortola Island, but it wouldn't be long before the English would eventually seize control of all the eastern islands and form them into the British Virgin Islands we know today. To the west, the Danes would make their first effort in colonizing these islands in the mid-1660s when Eric Smith claimed the island of St. Thomas for the Danish king. They intended to develop the land for plantation-based agriculture. Unfortunately, their initial efforts fell apart during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, when both the Dutch and English had no problem about raiding the Danes for supplies. After a year and a half, the few remaining settlers called it quits. In 1671, Denmark would try again in the form of the Danish West Indies Company, and this time they'd be successful. In a bit of irony, while this was a colony of Denmark, the Danes themselves never made up a majority of the white settlers. They always relied on other European countries to sort of fill the ranks. In some ways, this is very much an indicator how Denmark would always look at this colony, just as an investment to make money. Charlotte Amalie was founded in 1666, though that wasn't its original moniker. For the first 2.5 decades of its existence, it was known as Taphuis, literally meaning tap house or beer house, due to the amount of taverns and public houses that cropped up here in the early days to meet the demand of thirsty sailors. And competition between these establishments was fierce. In 1691, the name of this port would be changed to the one that it still holds to this very day, Charlotte Amalie, named after the Queen of Denmark and Norway at the time. For the Danes, the center of power here would be at this location, Fort Christian. Construction on this fort began in 1672, and it would take 8 years before it was completed. Once it was done, though, it became the clearest expression of Danish power on St. Thomas. Fort Christian is the oldest standing structure in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It's hard to tell these days from the surrounding area, but at one point this site would have controlled the harbor. Over the 350 years of its existence, it has played many roles. Besides its originally intended one, it has been the home of governors, a house of worship, a police station, and a prison. Today, the fort serves as a museum, welcoming visitors from around the world who are interested in the history of the Danish Virgin Islands. In 1764, Charlotte Amalie would be declared a free port, and it quickly became one of the busiest ports in the entire Caribbean. By the late 1700s, these islands, well, they were booming. The keys to this economic powerhouse was built on the backs of chattel slavery. The main commodities were sugar, cotton, and slaves themselves. Charlotte Amalie would be one of the largest slave markets in the Western Hemisphere. The genesis of this was a 1685 treaty signed by Denmark and the Duchy of Brandenburg, authorizing the latter to establish a slave trading business on St. Thomas. It's been estimated that over 250,000 humans were sold as slaves at the Charlotte Amalie slave market. Forced to make a hellish journey across the Atlantic to be auctioned off and then sent to other places in the Caribbean, or for many to the plantations of the American South. It is an atrocity that still echoes through our history to this very day. Not all slaves sold at the slave market left the islands, though. Slavery also fueled the other chief export of these islands, sugar. The plantations here were a never-ending meat grinder, demanding ever more human labor to meet Europe's insatiable demand for sugar. Sugar would be the white gold of the Caribbean. Prior to the 16th century, sugar was considered a rarity, a luxury that only the truly wealthy could indulge in. It was Columbus who brought sugar to the West Indies, bringing with him cane stalks from the Canary Islands, and setting the stage for centuries of human misery. Here in the Caribbean, sugar production would skyrocket. Its climate ideal for the growing of sugar cane. There was just one problem. Producing sugar in bulk was incredibly labor-intensive and dangerous work. In the beginning, Native American slaves and convicts were used, but both these populations were quickly exhausted due to the brutal conditions. The colonial powers quickly realized there was not enough native population in the Caribbean to produce sugar efficiently. They would have to import their labor. Their solution to this problem was to enslave Africans and transport them across the Atlantic. Sugar, more than any commodity, would drive the triangle trade. I was taught in school as rum, molasses, and slaves. It resulted in the largest forced migration in human history. For the Danes, these islands were a key part of their participation in that trade. Slaves for the plantations started arriving here in the 1670s and would continue for the next 160 years. At its height, it's been estimated the Danes were bringing in over 3,000 slaves a year to work the cane fields. St. Croix would become one of the wealthiest sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean. While the plantations in the Danish West Indies may never have quite reached the levels of production as, say, other locations in the Caribbean, the conditions here for the enslaved population were no less barbaric. If you were a slave on a sugar plantation, you had basically been consigned to a death sentence. Your average life expectancy was short. A third of enslaved people died within the first 3 years of their arrival. Men, women, and children were all expected to work long days from sunrise to sunset, and were quick to be punished for falling behind. During the harvest season, you would be working round the clock, with exhaustion and fatigue heightening your chances of being maimed by the machines and tools required to process the cane into sugar. Of the 3 islands, a majority of the sugar plantations were located on St. Croix, its flatter terrain more ideal to raising cane. There were also plantations here on St. John, and you can still see the ruins and visit them if you come over to the Virgin Islands National Park. This is Annaberg Plantation on St. John. It's a bit hard these days to get a sense of how the land was transformed with all the overgrowth, but in its heyday there would have been terraces of sugarcane fields surrounding this plantation. All the labor to make those fields, cultivate and harvest them, and then force the sugar out of the cane stalks would have had been done by slave labor. Black slaves would vastly outnumber white settlers, making up about 90% of the island's population. In 1725, on St. Thomas, there were 324 white settlers, as opposed to 4,490 slaves. Now, it really shouldn't be any surprise that with this population disparity and these oppressive conditions, that there would be slave revolts. The first slave revolt on these islands would occur in November 1733 on St. John, when 150 slaves rebelled against the overseers of the plantations. These slaves would go on to seize a fort on the island and several of the estates. The revolt would last until August 1734, when it was put down by French and Swiss soldiers from Martinique. It was one of the earliest and longest slave rebellions in the Americas. Denmark would be the first European nation to prohibit the transportation of African slaves across the Atlantic in 1803. It's rather ironic, though, because Denmark would continue to profit greatly from the slave trade. Full abolition in the Danish West Indies was a completely different story as well. Slavery would continue here for another 4.5 decades. Calls for abolition had started to rise over the ensuing decades, and in 1847 it had been decided that slavery would be abolished over the next 12 years, with children born after this date being free. This was too little, too late. In 1848, slavery would come to a sudden end on these islands, brought about by another revolt. On July 2nd, slaves on St. Croix, led by several people, including John Gottlieb Bordeaux, also known as General Budeau, rose up, burning plantations and seizing control of Frederiksstad. They numbered around 8,000 individuals. The following day, Peter von Scholten, the governor of the islands, traveled to Frederiksstad and declared the slaves emancipated. While the governor may not have had the authority to issue such a fiat, the reality of the situation had left little choice. The plantation owners may have been upset, but the actions of both sides of the rebellion avoided what
could have spiraled into a very bloody event.
Despite emancipation, not much actually changed. The former slaves were only free in a very narrow legal sense. Many still had to work on the very same sugar plantations in which they had been enslaved, now under a form of contracted service. Yes, they were paid, but it was incredibly meager, and it was non-negotiable. Furthermore, they could only leave their jobs on one day a year, October 1st, which became known as Contract Day. Basically, they had moved from slavery to serfdom, and living conditions actually deteriorated for many. These rules and regulations were put in place to be temporary, but they would continue in effect for the next 30 years.
The sugar economy was already losing steam in the mid-19th century as new production methods, drought, and particularly new competition from the advent of the sugar beet began driving prices down. The abolishment of slavery would be a tipping point that led to the collapse of the Danish West Indies sugar economy. On Contract Day of 1878, this situation would come to a head with the Fireburn labor riots. Laborers had gathered to protest low wages and poor labor conditions. Violence broke out as the Danish authorities tried to put down the protests. Things quickly spiraled, with 3/4 of the plantations on St. Croix burning to the ground, including the town of Frederiksstad. The laborers were led by a group of 4 women, known as the 4 Queens. They were Mary Thomas, Matilda McBean, Exeline Elizabeth Salomon, known as Agnes, and Susanna Abramson. By the end of 2 weeks, the riot had dwindled and peace returned. 100 laborers would be dead, 2 soldiers, and 1 plantation owner.
In the aftermath, 400 people would be arrested, 12 of them sentenced to death and executed immediately. Another 40 imprisoned. The 4 Queens were shipped off to Denmark, to Copenhagen, to a women's prison to serve terms of hard labor. There were some slight reforms, but in the end, it was actually rather little because the balance of power still very much rested in the hands of the plantation owners. The struggle for equality would have a long way yet to go.
The memory of slavery and the struggle of equality still affect the islands today. Many of the people who live here are descendants of those brought over in chains. The 3rd of July is a day of celebration across the islands, and Contract Day is still commemorated on 1 October. If you have a chance, make sure to visit Emancipation Garden in Charlotte Amalie.
With the collapse of the sugar economy, the Danes were starting to look more at their Caribbean colony as a liability than a sound investment. Emancipation, natural disasters, and depleted soil had all combined to make sugar production here rather cost prohibitive. Even Charlotte Amalie's role as a port was diminishing as new and improved longer-range steamships were now bypassing the port instead of stopping here to refill with coal.
The United States had shown interest in the islands almost immediately. There was an offer from the Andrew Johnson administration to purchase them for $7.5 million in 1867, though the deal fell through after the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the purchase. Another attempt would be made at the turn of the century, but this time the deal fell apart on the Danish side.
The U.S. had already acquired the Spanish Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. There was still some interest in the Danish West Indies, but it wasn't as pressing, at least not until World War I broke out.
This time, Interest in the islands was driven by strategic and military concerns, particularly about unrestricted warfare by German submarines affecting shipping in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. By 1915, tensions between the U.S. and Germany were on the rise, particularly after the sinking of the Lusitania. The big fear in the U.S. was if Germany would seize control of their northern neighbor in Europe, Denmark, and by extension take possession of these islands.
St. Thomas, with its excellent natural harbor, made perfect strategic sense as a naval installation, but it would be very detrimental to U.S. interests if that harbor was filled with German U-boats. The negotiations for the sale were held in secret due to the proclaimed neutrality of Denmark and the U.S. with the belligerents of World War I. Before the deal could be finalized, though, the Danes put it to a referendum of their own people. An interesting side note, this was the first referendum where women and servants were allowed to cast ballots. The results were 2/3 in favor of selling. The only people that really weren't allowed any voice in this whole deal were the people living here on the Virgin Islands.
A deal was struck in late 1916 and in early 1917. The U.S. purchased the islands for $25 million in gold, along with recognizing Denmark's claim to Greenland. For Denmark, this was the end of an era. The Virgin Islands were their last colony in the tropics. The islands became a U.S. territory on March 31, 1917, with the official name becoming the Virgin Islands of the United States. Despite new ownership, little else changed. The U.S. was more interested in this place as a Navy base than the people living here, with the initial governance of the islands falling to the U.S. Navy. Full U.S. citizenship to all residents born here wouldn't happen until 1932, and the residents of the islands wouldn't be able to vote for their own governor until 1969.
Over the course of the 20th century, the U.S. Virgin Islands would slowly transform into a tourist destination. The national park on St. John would be established in the 1950s. The harbor here at Charlotte Amalie once again becoming a preferred port, this time for cruise ships, and the mild tropical climate and the stunning beaches being a draw for people looking for a relaxing vacation.
To be quite candid, most people coming to these islands aren't here for the elevation. The Virgin Islands have a reputation as a tropical paradise, and these islands have some of the best beaches in the Caribbean, which draws a lot of attention from the tourist crowd. But if you have the time and are willing to get off the beaten path, you could have quite the high-pointing adventure if you summited the tallest peaks of all the major islands of the three groups, or if you just summited the highest point of each of the three groups, or if you just focused on the three main islands of the U.S. Virgin Islands.
That last one is definitely in the realm of possibility, and you won't need a passport to do it. One thing you'll want to consider, though, is make sure you have a plan on how you're going to get to each of the three islands and then how you're going to get around them once you arrive.
If you start from the lowest to the highest, your first stop will be on the island of St. Croix. Its highest point is Mount Eagle at 1,160 feet. Of the three, it may be the easiest in terms of navigating the trail, providing an excellent view. Your next stop will be the island of St. John, whose highest point is Bordeaux Mountain, with an elevation of 1,286 feet. You'll find it in the Virgin Islands National Park. There are a couple options in reaching the summit for this mountain. If you want a longer hike from the sea to the top, you can take the Lampshire Trail. Or, if pressed for time, you can drive up Bordeaux Mountain Road and hike a short distance to bag the summit.
Your final destination may, in some ways, provide the most challenge, and it's the reason why we're here today. Crown Mountain, St. Thomas. Needless to say, this peak is not what you would think of as a straightforward high point.
One of the things you'll immediately notice when you arrive here is just how hilly and steep this island is. It's one of the reasons St. Thomas never had the amount of sugar plantations St. John or St. Croix did. The island is dominated by a major ridge running the length of it, with numerous spurs jutting off. The highest point on the ridge is Crown Mountain, which also happens to be the easternmost U.S. major high point in the Western Hemisphere. Most people on St. Thomas aren't aware of their island's highest point. If you were to ask folks around here where the high point actually was, they'd point you in the direction of Mountaintop, one of the most popular tourist destinations on the island.
This is something that Mountaintop advertises. You'll even find it on their website where they insist they are the highest point in St. Thomas. So this is something also to keep in mind, because if you decide you want to take a taxi up to the high point, well, they are going to insist on taking you here. But it just isn't true.
Officially, this is St. Peter Mountain, named after the settlement that was up here. The peak comes in with an elevation of 1,480 feet, making it the second highest peak on the island, but the highest peak where you can get a banana daiquiri.
Mountaintop does have one distinct advantage over the Territory High Point. It has an amazing view. Unfortunately, the popularity of this place sort of overshadows the actual Territory High Point. And in my mind, this creates a bit of a missed opportunity for St. Thomas to highlight another potential tourist spot.
I'd argue the best way to get to the top of Crown Mountain is to drive. There is no trail that will take you to it, and technically you could hike to the top of this peak, but you'd have to contend with the roads, and the roads here can be a bit treacherous. They are narrow, steep, and with no sidewalks to be found.
If you do decide to drive, keep in mind that this is the only place in the United States where you will drive on the left-hand side. I'm going to start at Fort Christian, one of the big landmarks in downtown Charlotte Amalie. It's about a 15-minute drive to the top.
As you head up the mountain, you'll notice there isn't much in the way of views. Besides the observation deck at Mountaintop, if you want some great views of the island, you may also want to check out the aforementioned Drake's Seat, or the Charlotte Amalie Overlook, or you could always take the tramway up to Paradise Point. These are all popular destinations, so if you want to have a more solitary experience, make sure to visit them on a day when there are no cruise ships in port. Eventually, you shall make your way onto Tower Drive, also known as Highway 334, and you'll arrive at an unpaved maintenance road. The coordinates for this location are right here. You'll also find them in the description below. This is a good place to park your vehicle. Once here, you'll see a fenced-in area. There is a very good chance this is going to be as far as you can go. The summit is restricted, with locked gates and posted with no trespassing signs. The benchmark is beyond the fence on a rock under the radio tower.
And here we are, on the rooftop of the U.S. Virgin Islands, the summit of Crown Mountain. or at least as close as we'll be able to make it today. With an elevation of 1,555 feet, this is the fourth highest major territory high point in the U.S. If we were going to put it on the state count, it would be above number 43 Ohio and below number 42 Iowa. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.